The committee will come to order. Before we begin, on behalf of the committee, I would like to express our condolences to the family members of the 7 UN personnel murdered in Afghanistan last Friday and of the 32 people, both UN staff and others, who died Monday in a plane crash in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. If I may, I would ask that in our seats we observe a moment of silence for those who have lost their lives. Thank you. After recognizing myself and the ranking member, my good friend Mr. Berman, for 7 minutes each for our opening statements, we will then recognize members of the committee who seek recognition for 1 minute each. The chair will then recognize our distinguished witness and a friend of the committee, Ambassador Rice. Following her testimony, members will be recognized for questions under the 5-minute rule. Without objection, Ambassador Rice's prepared statement will be made a part of the record, and members may have 5 days to insert statements and questions for the record, subject to the limitations of length in the rules. The chair now recognizes herself for 7 minutes. It's always a pleasure to welcome you back to our committee. Thank you, Ambassador Rice, for your appearance today. This is the third session the committee has held this year on reforming the United Nations. In the past decade, the UN's regular budget has more than doubled, but has the UN's transparency, accountability, or effectiveness increased in proportion? Well, the former head of the UN's own internal ethics office had this to say in her exit report, excerpts of which were leaked to the press, quote, "There is no transparency. There is a lack of accountability. I regret to say that the UN Secretariat now is in a process of decay. It is drifting into irrelevance," end quote. The UN has never released the full report to the public. Former UN Deputy Secretary General Mark Malloch Brown said earlier this year, "There's a huge redundancy and lack of efficiency in the UN system, and that the UN budget is utterly opaque, untransparent, and completely in shadow," end quote. Some take comfort in the UN General's call for a 3% cut in the next biennial budget. But 3%? That's like foregoing a cost of living increase. At our hearing last month, we considered lessons learned from past UN reform attempts to ensure that present and future efforts are based on what works. The most important lesson, money talks. In fact, Ambassador Rice, you recognized this in a February 2005 op-ed published in the Washington Post entitled, "Promoting Democracy, Money Talks." Almost every productive U.S. effort at reforming the UN has been based on withholding our contributions unless and until needed reforms are implemented. In the 1990s, when the UN regular and peacekeeping budgets were skyrocketing, Congress enacted the Helms-Biden Agreement. The U.S. withheld our dues and conditioned payments on key reforms. When the UN saw that we meant business, they agreed to changes that saved U.S. taxpayers' funds. So smart withholding works. Given now that Vice President Biden signed on to smart withholding then, and it worked, I hope that the administration will now agree to support it. But smart withholding alone is insufficient to produce the lasting systemic reform that our U.S. taxpayers are demanding. That is why we must move funding from the UN budget and the UN entities from an assessed to a voluntary basis. Americans, not UN bureaucrats or other countries, should determine how much taxpayer dollars are spent on the UN, where they go, and for what purpose. That is at the core of the United Nations Transparency, Accountability, and Reform Act, which I first introduced in the year 2007, and which I will soon be reintroducing with updates to reflect recent developments concerning the UN. We should pay for UN programs and activities that advance our interests and our values. If other countries want different things to be funded, they can pay for it. The voluntary model works for UNICEF, for the World Food Program, and other UN entities, and it can work for the UN as a whole. Catherine Bertini, the former UN Undersecretary General for Management and Director of the World Food Programs, has said, quote, "Voluntary funding creates an entirely different atmosphere at the World Food Program than at the UN. At the WFP, every staff member knows that we have to be as efficient, accountable, transparent, and results-oriented as possible. If we are not, donor governments can take their funding elsewhere in a very competitive world among UN agencies, NGOs, and bilateral governments," end quote. Ambassador Rice, so with respect to the references in your prepared testimony to the UN Office of Internal Oversight Services, I must highlight that scores of procurement, corruption, and fraud cases from the now-defunct Procurement Task Force are collecting dust in this Office of Internal Oversight Services. The job of lead investigator has not been filled on a permanent basis since 2006. The individual who currently holds that position on an interim basis is under investigation himself for retaliating against whistleblowers. Finally, Madam Ambassador, your written testimony says, quote, "The UN helps isolate terrorists and human rights abusers," end quote. But Iran is on the board of the UN Commission on the Status of Women. The vice chair of the UN Human Rights Council is the Cuban regime. The majority of the council members are not free nations. And until Gaddafi's massacre of civilians forced its expulsion, Libya had a seat on the council. The council, of course, did manage at last month's session to adopt 6 resolutions attacking our free democratic ally, Israel, more than at any previous session. The Council also recommended the referral of the anti-Israel Goldstone report to the UN Security Council and the International Criminal Court. The 5-year review of the Council has indicated no real structural reforms will be forthcoming. Even the U.S. mission has called this process, quote, "a race to the bottom," end quote. The Syrian regime is brutally attacking its people, yet it is running unopposed for a seat on the Human Rights Council. The absence of structural reforms has real consequences. We appreciate the limited tactical victories that the U.S. and other nations won at the Council's most recent sessions. But that is just not enough. Most of us want a more accountable and effective UN. I believe that the way to achieve this is to require reform first, pay later. And lastly, I ask that the U.S. do all we can, Madam Ambassador, to ensure that the Palestinian lobby does not gain member status in the UN before negotiating a true peace with our ally Israel.